Welcome back to the series which seeks to give you a solid foundation of understanding with respect to the different classes and how they shape up as tanks. Now I've already released my first episode in this series which covered the Dragon Knight, which is the best tank in my opinion by the way, so if you do want to check that out I'd recommend doing so, and I'll also give a little bit of an introduction as to how I structure these videos so it may help your understanding. With that said, I also want to briefly say that any feedback would be great. Tell me if you enjoyed the video perhaps, or just let me know if something wasn't quite right and you'd like to see it improved for next time, as obviously the videos being of a high quality, a high standard is very important to me, and I think it's also important that it helps you guys in a significant way and is not just something that you wish you hadn't watched at the end of it. Anyways, with that said, let's get into talking about Templar, and the first category we're going to look at is self-sustainability. So the Adric Spearline is the first one to consider, and in terms of the main ability here, Blazing Shields is the one to look at. Now, in terms of shielding, it is quite efficient, though the downside is when you compare it to Igneous Shields, is that it's not going to be able to shield your group, making it quite a lot worse actually, when we compare it to the shielding options that Dragon Knights have. So, what can be said about Blazing Shield? Well, it's actually quite a flexible option as well. It allows you to go into PvP with it, but if you're just solely looking at PvE, the other morph actually is probably better, because damage isn't so much important in PvE as a tank, and the reduced cost in addition to the stronger shield is probably going to be more worthwhile for you in order to be able to take bigger hits and be more self-sustainable from the group. Now, since I did mention the downsides of this not shielding your group, there are some benefits to running it on your bar, and that's because of the Spear Wall passive. Now, this is going to be increasing the amount of damage you can block from melee attacks by 15%, which is actually quite significant, and is generally going to make you a little bit more tanky and less liable to dying when you're tanking harder hitting opponents. So, nice to have in your bar, and it does kind of justify Blazing Shields despite the fact that it only shields yourself. Now another passive to look at is Balanced Warrior, and the increased weapon damage by 6% on the face of it doesn't look like a self-sustainability kind of benefit, but if you are running a stamina tank and using Vigor for example, it will increase the heal a little bit, meaning you see some kind of improvement in both your self-heals from that ability and also the healing to your group. In a similar way to the Dragon Knight spell resistance passive, if you don't have capped spell resist, it's also going to increase your resistance to elemental damage, reducing the damage you're taking from it, so it just makes you a little bit more tanky and is always a good thing for your tank. Now, you can also, I guess, talk about Radial Sweep, though I want to mention that the morph we're talking about is the one that's going to be reducing the damage you're taking from enemies when they're hit by this, and that does scale depending on how many enemies are hit by it, so it can be quite a significant damage reduction debuff, I guess, or buff, I suppose. But in terms of why I don't really want to stress the importance of this too much is that often we're going to be using Warhorn, as you see down here, Warhorn, not morphed yet on this character, but a very important ability to run, which means that Radial Sweep isn't quite strong enough to justify using it, though I guess when you're first leveling up and you have access to Warhorn, it might be something you want to use, especially in a weaker group where the healer might not be keeping you up so well and you need to have that extra little bit of damage reduction so you can survive some of the boss encounters. Moving on to Dawn's Wrath, there's not too much to say in terms of self-sustainability. I will cover Solar Prison and group utility, but in terms of self-sustainability, the only real passive to talk about is perhaps Restoring Spirit. And the reason this is in the self-sustainability category is because it reduces the amount of magicka or stamina or ultimate cost we actually have to use to activate our abilities, which in turn makes us a bit more sustainable because we can cast more abilities in the long run. Helps out in a class, especially in Templar, because their self-sustain is actually relatively weak, at least when you compare it to Nightblades or Dragon Knights. Moving now on to the Restoring Light, there's actually a number of great abilities here, though I am primarily going to talk about the self-sustain aspect of them as they naturally tend to be also focusing on group utility since it is a more of a supporty kind of healing line than the other lines that we've already looked at. So Honor the Dead is the first ability to consider, and the reason we've morphed it here away from Breath of Life, which is probably the more familiar morph, is especially as a stamina tank on a Templar, you're going to be suffering from issues of magicka sustain, so when we're using this ability, the fact that it's going to be restoring magicka to us just helps us to cast more magicka abilities in the long run, which is never a bad thing. Also keep in mind you can cast this on yourself when under 75% HP to benefit from it as well, so it's a nice way to be quite self-sustainable, both from a HP perspective and resource perspective. Now the next ability to talk about is Radiant Aura, and because of the homestead changes and the implementation of Minor Magicka Steel, this actually allows Templar tanks to provide a useful buff to the group if they don't already have it. And for tanks in general, Minor Magicka Steel allows us to maintain our magicka resources much better than before, because it doesn't require us to apply elemental damage to the enemy we're attacking, which is affected by this, but just any damage in general is going to allow us to get our magicka back. So it's a very nice way for tanks to maintain their resources, which prior to the fact, prior to Homestead, they didn't really have that option available to them, and you had to be a bit more careful with your magicka spending. The ability also provides some minor recovery buffs, so the only one of note, to be honest, is magical recovery, but this is probably not strong enough to justify a front bar spot, and I'd recommend just using this for the actual minor magic steal buff. Also keep in mind, if you want to maintain your resources a bit better stamina and health wise, you can morph this to Repentance, which consumes dead corpses and gives you back stamina and health of a one-time use, but is also a little bit inflexible in that if there's not any corpses to Repentance, it's not going to give you much benefit. Moving now on to Ritual of Retribution. This is an excellent ability because it allows us to self-cleanse ourselves from dangerous debuffs, and a common example of this is Cradle of Shadows, where when you get debuffed, for example, little orbs that float around, if you don't cleanse yourself, it can actually result in you dying and consequently the group wiping. Nice to be able to have this kind of independence as a Templar tank, as no other tank in the game has the option, for class abilities at least, to cleanse themselves and is often reliant on the healer, for example, giving them Purify. Finally, let's look at Restoring Focus, and this is a class ability which is going to be giving us our major resistance buffs in line with the other classes. However, there's a few differences with this, and probably the most important one is the fact that it's placed on the ground and is a sigil that you need to stand on in order to benefit. However, it's not quite that inflexible, as we can leave the area for 8 seconds, and as long as we come back we can refresh it to get the full 26-second uptime on the buff. In terms of morphs, I would recommend this one primarily because it also provides us with minor protection and minor vitality, increasing the amount of healing we're receiving and also decreasing the amount of damage we're taking, which are both excellent for a tank, and increasing our own kind of ability to take damaging hits more effectively, and also allows our group's heals to go a bit further because the damage we're taking is decreased. Before moving on to group utility and considering the ways that Templars can provide good group support and also nice ad management, I want to talk about, once again, the downsides of the Templar tank with respect to resource management. So as you probably already noticed, if you've looked at my Dragon Knight video at least, they do not really have any abilities which quite compare to Dragon Knights in terms of resource maintenance. What can be said, as I've said before, is that minor Magicka Steal is a helpful for maintaining our Magicka, and to be honest, Repentance can be a crucial ability to run instead of Radiant Aura, so morphing it to Repentance, and it allows us to maintain our stamina a lot better than if we weren't using it, though that is reliant on the fact that we're going to have to rely on dead enemies being present in order to consume their corpses, and consume is the term that's actually on the tooltip, to get back stamina, or if it's not on the tooltip, it's how I remember it at least. So with that said, you should keep in mind that while Templar does have some benefits which we'll see become more apparent as we talk about group utility, the resource management is definitely not as strong as Dragon Knight, and it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your tank, and it's also why I run racial-wise Argonian on my Templar tank to get a little bit extra, and we'll just briefly look at it now, to get a little bit extra resources back here, 12% max health, magic and stamina from our potions, just to allow ourselves to sustain our resources that bit more. Anyways, let's talk about group utility. The ability that really shines in this tree is Luminous Shards, and it's probably one you're quite familiar with, as healers often use it because it's an excellent way of ensuring your group's resources are maintained. Now, it was better when stamina DPS were more prominent, but even with the nerfs to stamina DPS, it's still useful for Magicka DPS because often, at least at endgame, they'll use sets like Moondancer which require a synergy to actually activate, so they'll use this, and on top of that they'll get a little bit of Magicka back. It can also be incorporated in supporting your main tank, for example, if you're the off tank in trials which require 2 tanks, as you can cast this and they can use it not only to get their stamina back because they're tanking the boss and they require that to hold up block, but can also use it to activate Alkosh, which is a debuff and is quite powerful and employed in most meta tank builds at the moment. Overall, a great ability that I'd highly recommend using, though probably one you want to have in your back bar, as it's something that perhaps isn't as crucial to maintain 100% uptime on as some other abilities. Now, while we kind of did gloss over Dawn's Wrath in terms of self-sustainability, for group utility there are a few nice options to talk about here, and Power of the Light is the first one, and this is a very unique ability to Templar tanking, or Templars in general I guess, because it allows us to apply Minor Fracture and Minor Breach to the boss, meaning that they're taking the most damage possible, and is unique, at least for Templar tanks, in that no other tank can provide this debuff. Also keep in mind that it synergizes quite nicely with Prism, which is a passive which is going to be restoring us some ultimate, and it can occur every 6 seconds, which funnily enough lines up with the 6-second duration of this ability. Now, one thing to say about Prism is even though it is nice, it's certainly not unique to Templar, and all the other classes have some kind of ultimate regen passive. Moving now on to talk about Solar Prison, this is probably the most powerful ultimate that Templars have available to them, because it can be used especially in harder vet trial content to circumnavigate or avoid certain damaging abilities, which could even wipe the raid if it's not used. This does mean though, that while it is powerful, it's certainly not used in general more than Warhorn, but in certain situations can be invaluable to have in your group. Now, one of the strengths of this is that it doesn't actually require your allies to be standing within the area of effect, but only requires the enemy that you're actually putting it on. Now, this might seem fairly obvious, but it's in direct comparison to Veil of Blades, which actually requires your allies to be standing in it to get the 30% damage reduction. This just means that overall this ability is much more flexible and does mean that it actually is used in certain situations in endgame trial content, though, once again, obviously Warhorn is going to take precedent for you most of the time as a tank. Now, some other useful abilities to talk about are Enduring Rays. Now, by increasing the duration of abilities, it's just overall quite nice because it means our resources go further. Since we have to spend less time casting it as it lasts longer, we're going to be able to maintain resources better, and it can also increase the effectiveness of our ultimate ability. Illuminate is another one to talk about, though because of Templar's predominance in trials and in other content, it's not going to be so much unique to us, but on the bright side, it does allow us to apply minor sorcery to our group, which is certainly better than Dragon Knight's ability to apply weapon damage given the predominance of Magicka-based DPS at the moment. Moving now on to Restoring Light, I just want to touch, I guess, very briefly on some abilities already. Obviously, Honor of the Dead is great for healing our allies. Radiant Aura is excellent for applying minor Magicka Steel to our group. But the first real ability to talk about is going to be Ritual of Retribution, mainly because it allows our allies to access a cleanse, and it's a synergy more importantly, so this means that they can both activate sets like Moondancer for more DPS, while saving themselves from some debuffs which, if they couldn't cleanse it, might actually kill them. It probably goes without saying, but obviously the extra heal to our allies is going to be quite nice in helping them stay alive, though it isn't that significant. There are definitely stronger heals in the game, and certainly with our Templar tank, if we're going to be stamina based, want to incorporate a bit more powerful healing into our build, such as Vigor, to truly be healing our allies. However, the power of this ability really shines when we look at Sacred Ground. And this passive is excellent first off because it gives us access to major mending while we're standing within it, and this makes us one of two, the other being Dragon Knight, of tanks that have access to major mending. Now this is actually a bit better and stronger in my opinion than the major mending of Dragon Knights, because since Ritual of Retribution, which by the way is the Morph of Cleansing Ritual, lasts for 12 seconds, this is significantly longer than Igneous Shield, which grants major mending, meaning that we can actually have higher uptimes more consistently on it than Dragon Knights could. So excellent there, and definitely a minor benefit to Templar tanking in terms of how major mending works in this class. Major mending is also part of the reason why Templar actually makes it into the second position in terms of how I rate the classes, because for me major mending is a crucial component to ensuring you can support your group as much as possible within extremely hard content, as a 25% increase to your healing can really go a long way, and is likewise why I think, partially why at least, Dragon Knight is as strong as it is. So something that you really should not gloss over and is one of the great advantages to Templar tanking. Now another aspect, and you may have noticed already though, is a downside of Templar tanking is that our ad management is pretty much non-existent. Now Sacred Ground does help to alleviate that a little bit. As you see here, when they're standing within our cleansing ritual, they're going to be snared, and while we can't really control ads necessarily, except with, taunting them using that method and kind of perhaps trying to line of sight stack with them, this snare will allow our allies to maybe kite uncontrolled ads and survive. However, because Templar offers a few more key advantages, I think the downside of this can be alleviated, and certainly your group can pick up the slack, meaning that all is not lost in terms of you being viable for endgame. Before covering the last really exciting passive, let's just briefly look at Mending. A nice little extra heal from our Restoring Light abilities when our allies are at low health, and is just overall a nice little bit, as I said, extra healing. Not too much to say though, it's nothing too substantial. However, Master Ritualist certainly is substantial, and this is going to allow us to shine in an off-tank position in particular, because often off-tanks are told to res dead allies. So why is this excellent? Well, by increasing the resurrection speed by 20%, it means there's less time spent resing the ally and having them dead on the ground, and more time spent actually having them alive applying DPS, meaning that there's less DPS loss due to group deaths. In addition, resurrected allies are going to return with 100% more HP. And why is this important? Well, primarily because when individuals are dead, often it's difficult to see if damaging effects are currently occurring. And time again, I've seen people res right into a damaging effect and instantly go down again dead. So by coming back with more HP, it mitigates or diminishes the chance that allies are going to instantly die when resurrected, and can help alleviate some mistakes or bad resing, so to speak. So excellent ability, and is also unique to Templar, and why I think they could operate very well at endgame in the off-tank position. Finally, let's look at flexibility, and these abilities I'm going to talk about are not really used in general, but in certain fights and certain situations they can shine. So in Edric's Spear line, Puncturing Sweeps or the Stamina Morph can be quite good at low level if you want to provide a little bit of extra DPS when killing ads, for example. Now Puncturing Sweep is a more safe version because while your block is dropped, as channels drop block in general, you're going to be healing for the damage done. though when you get to endgame it's not something you're going to be using, as it's not our role as a tank to be providing DPS. Another excellent ability is Focus Charge, and I guess probably one of the most prominent usages of this would be in Cradle of Shadows, where you're actually required to charge to an enemy to interrupt an effect. And traditionally, if you don't have access to something like this, you'd have to use your Sword and Board ability, which is a shield charge, to do it. So it's always nice to have a Magicka option, as that does cost stamina to do the same thing. As you see here, any enemy that is hit by this, its casting is also going to be interrupted, and that's exactly what we want. Excellent ability, and sometimes going to be used, though once again very fringe and will not in general be used. Just thought I'd mention it though. In terms of Dawn's Wrath, I'm going to be very honest, I haven't used Solar Flare or Eclipse very much whatsoever, and as such perhaps there may be some benefit to that I'm missing. Please do let me know in the comments if there is something, but from my understanding both Solar Flare here and Eclipse are not that useful for tanks whatsoever. Now, Radiant Destruction I have played around with, and if you are looking for a bit of fun and trying to provide some extra execute damage, feel free to try it, though I will stress this is a pretty terrible option for tanks, and is strictly if you're feeling like just messing around with some mates in a veteran dungeon or something like that. Now, Sunfire is the ability that kind of flexibility-wise probably offers the most promise, especially when it's split into the free projectile morph, because it allows us to get initial aggro onto enemies from range, meaning we can prevent any untimely deaths to DPS who might run in ahead of us, and allows us to get aggro onto the ally enemies before they switch onto our DPS. Now, unfortunately for me, the ability is marred a little bit because if we go to here, Ritual of Retribution is an AoE which does damage, so it's going to do a very similar effect but actually hit more enemies, meaning it's much better in my opinion, but thought I'd mention it nonetheless. Finally, when we get to Restoring Light, once again we've covered almost all of this. Restoring Light is a great line of abilities and passives, so that pretty much wraps it up. So that's all for today guys, talking about the Templar. I hope it really did give you a solid foundational understanding of why Templar might make sense for you as a tank, but also why it doesn't compare so favourably to Dragon Knight, but nevertheless still comes in at position number 2 in terms of the overall ranking of the classes. In the next episode we're going to be covering Nightblade, and if you've been following my channel at least a little bit, you'll know I'm quite fond of my Nightblade tanks, and I'm quite excited to do that episode, and hopefully won't have to wait too long, but unfortunately at the moment I'm quite busy with my university dissertation alongside some other adventures I'm involved in at the moment, so please do bear with me. I was actually planning to get this one out a bit earlier, but unfortunately the first take of this didn't work out so well. Anyways, until next time guys, take care all, thanks once again for the support, and until next time, bye for now.